the ocean. Meet the ocean.
Wow, when did I first meet the ocean? I grew up in Austin, Texas, and I remember my parents taking me to Corpus Christi and Galveston when I was a kid. And just remember being astounded by it, looking out there, and it started resonating with me from that moment.
The man sharing his story is Jay Dickman, a National Geographic photographer and Pulitzer Prize winning photojournalist.
And as a little bit later teenager, I would go down to the coast with a buddy of mine and rent surfboards, and we'd go, and that's kind of an oxymoron of surfing in Texas, but they have a couple of decent little areas to surf. But that kind of furthered it. Then took dive lessons when I was working with a newspaper in the mid-'70s. They paid for my PADI instruction. I was doing a story on, what was the heck of it? Greens Bayou, I think it was, off the coast of Texas, where a Spanish explorer's ship had sunk, and there was, I think it was Texas A&M was doing archaeological work on that, and I went down there with the idea that, I rented a house. No, I rented a Nokonis, and I was going to get the classic scene in this bayou of looking down, with the pure water, with the ship defined, with the divers. I had all this imagination of this projected image of what it was going to look like. When I got down there and got in the water, they had big blasters blowing the sand out from the scene. Texas coast is not known for stellar visibility either. When I got under the water, the visibility was maybe 6 to 7 inches. And it was like, oh my God, what'd I do? But I pulled a picture out of it. And ever since then, I've had that love for water. Love the ocean. Oh my gosh, and like I said, when we got back in at Millennium Atoll and on that South Pacific trip, it was just like reopening my heart to this amazing world of water. Oh my God, it was just spectacular. I could go into all these old diving stories and everything else, but I absolutely love getting into the water. And it was interesting because I remember rolling, it had been a couple of years since I dived, but I remember clearing the BC and going back under and just like, oh, I know this place. This is magical. And nothing failed me on that dive, emotionally or equipment. But what I'm trying to say is that it reinforced just how magical it is once you put your head under the water, or stand there, look at the water, or just get around the water.
Welcome to another episode of Meet the Ocean. This is episode 6, and here we are.
I love scuba diving.
My name is Paul North, an undersea specialist and ocean conservation enthusiast. Jay Dickman and I met somewhere, and I might have to leave it at that because at this point we have worked together so many times that I've lost track, and I'm just going to assume that he has too. But that's okay because every time I get to work with Jay, I learn something. What is important to note is not that Jay is a good photographer. Those exist. They're around, trust me. But also that he's a good teacher. He helps people understand how to better interact with their cameras and possibly do what many forget, which is to use them for what they are. A lens through which we get to see the world. Welcome to the show, Jay.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate you having me on here.
We have been on board the National Geographic Explorer for about 3 weeks now, and what have we been doing?
Well, we've been exploring the Canadian Arctic, checking out ports on Greenland, amazing spots on Greenland, up to Ellesmere, to Baffin Island. It's almost too much information to recall here. It has been an incredible expedition.
What is your role on board?
I'm the National Geographic photographer on board this trip, here to provide expertise and knowledge and I guess really to be seen as a resource for the folks on this trip, to help them out on their photographic journey while they're in this incredible place on this wonderful expedition.
And I think something that I always enjoy when you're on board is there's a bit of myth that goes on in the photography world, and people ascribe either to the binary of Canon or Nikon, and yet you shoot entirely outside of that.
That I do. I'm an Olympus user. I'm a big believer in the micro four thirds world. I think it's kind of where the industry has to go, with camera sales on the DSLR market falling off worldwide, and the only area of growth is in the mirrorless system. And in a smaller system, a lot of younger, and I mean photographers 40 and 50 and below, don't want to carry the big heavy equipment anymore, and they've grown up in that world of iPhones and cameras readily available when they want them. And that's what I love about this micro four thirds system, that I can carry this equipment all day, don't notice the weight on my shoulders, and it goes back to the old adage, what's the best camera to have? It's the one that's in your hands when you need it. And that's what I love about this equipment.
So we're talking about photography, and in order to understand that better, since photography means painting with light, I brought in a heavy hitter, scientist, and designer, Skye Moret.
Hello.
Hi, Skye. Could you please describe to our audience the very easy question of how light works in the ocean?
I would love to. Light in the ocean is a hot commodity. All the photosynthetic organisms living at the surface of the ocean that are creating the bulk of the Earth's oxygen that we are breathing right now are reliant on all of this light getting into that top 100 to 200 meters of the water column. So in the tropics, where we see really clear water, the photic zone, or this area where light is penetrating, is about 200 meters deep. And in mid-latitudes, the light's penetrating maybe 100 meters, 300 plus feet. And in coastal waters, where you kind of see it murky, there's lots of plankton there, lots of productivity, maybe some river runoff. It's only penetrating about, maybe 100 feet at the most. So this is where all the magic is happening, right? Phytoplankton, these photosynthesizers, these plants are the base of the food chain. And if you've ever been snorkeling or scuba diving, you may have noticed that not all of the colors of the rainbow are reaching all of the different depths where we see all these different creatures. I once went in a submarine off the coast of Honolulu, and we went down maybe 40 feet, and they had big windows, and I looked at everybody after kind of peering out the window and being amazed at what I was seeing. I looked at my friends, and all of their lips were blue, and their pink tank top was blue, and their red t-shirt was blue, and I was like, what is going on? And it was I was taking marine science class at the time at University of Hawaii, and I was just learning about light in the water column, and it turns out that red wavelengths really only last maybe 3, 4, 5 feet in the water column, and you start losing all of those wavelengths, and really only green and blue wavelengths are the ones that make it to deeper depths. And that's why we see all that blue light scattering back to us, and that's why we think of the ocean as this blue surface, when really there's all kinds of complex magic going on.
Complex light magic, disappearing colors, who knew? But if you think that sounds difficult, try working as a career photographer. Since I had Jay on the mic, I had to ask about his origins.
Holy cow, I was an English lit major in college, but you have to go back much before that to kind of understand where I got the interest. My dad gave me 2 books when I was a kid, U.S. Camera at War, from World War II, way, way, way before my time. But the images, black and white images of these, photographs from World War II, I remember looking at those books, and looking back now, I know what was most relevant to me, most impressing me, were the frozen moment aspect of those images, the composition, the structure, the moment above all. And I remember looking at those books. I still have those things. Then growing up in 60s and 70s, I was a product child, viewer, subscriber to Life magazine, to National Geographic, and looking at those 2 publications. Life magazine, it was during the time of the U.S. space missions, the civil rights movement in the United States, the Vietnam War, and Life magazine was kind of the television set of the day. And getting to look at those images, those frozen moments again, just blew me away. My dad came from that generation that you get a job in the real world with a factory, or not a factory, but a company, and you stay there all your life till they give you a retirement party of some sort. And I just didn't want to do that. And part of the reason I was an English lit major, I wanted to teach English literature. And when I told him that kind of put him over the top. And then when I told him I wanted to be a photographer, I think that did it completely. Those people are weird. Those people are crazy. They're broke all the time. It's a struggle. And he was right on every one of those. But it's been an amazing ride. I absolutely love what I get to do. At times, I get so tired of the travel, which is constantly, actually. I don't want to leave my wife. I don't want to leave my home. Don't want to leave the comfort of that space you build. And I go through this drill every time when I'm getting close to leaving and I'm getting those feelings like, I don't want to leave again. I'm tired of this. I reach into the camera bag, pick the camera up, and it's still this electricity that goes through me. It's a thing like, I can't believe I get to do this. And if that ever goes, I have to get a real job, and I have no clue what I'm going to do. But I kind of fudged my way into a newspaper job in 1970. That was my first job. I convinced the photo director there at the Dallas Times-Herald to hire me as a photographer. It was kind of a sleepy afternoon paper when I got on, but it was well represented in the photographic world. They hired me as a staff photographer. I almost called in on Friday to tell them I couldn't come in. I wouldn't do it. I couldn't do it. I had embellished my resume slightly, but I didn't pick the phone up. And it's one of those moments that I know now if I'd picked the phone up, I would have dialed the number, he would have answered, I would have told him I can't do it. It was one of those moments in your life where it's like, you look back at it, that was a major crossroads moment for me. I went in Monday. One of the first photographers to whom they introduced me was Bob Jackson, staff photographer for the Times-Herald, who photographed the image that I think everyone knows instantly. It's a photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald being shot by Jack Ruby. And it struck me like I am in over my head. But it was an amazing learning ground. Out the gate, it was 3 to 5 assignments a day. The editors didn't want to hear you were not feeling creative, you weren't in the mood, you had to produce. And I look back, and it's interesting that most National Geographic photographers have come from newspaper backgrounds. And I think it's because they're used to dealing with visual narrative on a daily basis. The 3 components of that world were spot news photography, sports photography, and feature photography. Working within those 3 disciplines, within that general world as a newspaper photographer, gave me that ability to craft visual narrative that National Geographic, the classic magazine, really demands of its photographers. So here I am. I look back on my liberal arts education. I realize that was important to me, that to be able to learn how to write, how to make sense of the sentence structure, how to build a proposal, how to build an idea. So that's kind of the down and dirty quick answer to that question.
And now back to scientist Skye Moret with more on how color works in the ocean. You have a very specific way to example how that color changes related to depth. It's a very interesting experiment, as I remember.
Yes, so I had the opportunity of sailing with Paul in the tropical Pacific, and one of the ways that we teach students, deckhands, fellow crew members, how to understand what is going on in the ocean with regard to these complex ideas of electromagnetic radiation hitting the surface and diffusing, like what is happening, all of that light is converting to heat. That's really hard to simply explain to somebody. You can use mathematical equations, or you can throw M&Ms in the water. So what we do is we carry a few extra giant bags of M&Ms, and we split them into bowls, and we say, we're doing this very statistical experiment on how light penetrates ocean layers, and we split the entire crew, about 40 people, into groups of 10. We give one person a stopwatch, and each group a bowl of M&Ms, and everybody takes a red M&M, says go, and they toss the red M&M into the water, and they time how long they can see that M&M. And when they stop seeing it, everybody says something, they stop, and we're able to kind of quantify the fact that like green and blue M&Ms we can see a bit deeper. And then, we plot everything out on a whiteboard, and sure enough, you see red M&Ms for just a few seconds, then blue and green M&Ms you can see for quite a bit longer. So it really drives it home. People remember this gem experiment of putting these M&Ms in the water. So the photic zone is only the top couple hundred meters of water. It's really this fine vulnerable kind of surface layer that's warming from all of this electromagnetic radiation. The base of the food chain, that's all living in a very thin, warm surface layer, which is kind of mind-blowing when you think of how deep the ocean is, right? The average depth is 12,000 feet or something. It's pretty deep. When we think about what the majority of the ocean looks like, it is dark. It's called the aphotic zone, no light. And only near the top do you start to get the dysphotic zone, which is where animals can still see, but there's definitely no photosynthesis going on. Kind of lots of predation. You're fighting for your life out there. So you see, especially in the aphotic zone, dysphotic zone, you start seeing a lot of interesting adaptations happening with creatures adapting the light that's coming off of their own bodies with these things called photophores, which are kind of tricky little cells that mimic the light that's above them, so they don't create a shadow. When creatures are looking up from the deep, they don't see this dark silhouette against the surface. They don't see anything. And so creatures have amazing adaptations to deal with living in the photic zone and migrating up and down and eating what they want to eat and not being eaten.
Speaking of color, I just opened a recent issue of E Squared magazine, and I happened to see your face inside of its pages.
Yes, I had the opportunity to show some of my color-related work about creatures that live in Antarctica with the help of your photographs from the Southern Ocean. We were able to kind of take the message out of all of these photographs from Antarctica. We showed a bunch of photographs above the sea surface and below the sea surface, and simply sampled pixels, left to right, top to bottom, took these pixels out, these colored pixels, to show off that when people commonly think of Antarctica, they think of this gray, white, blue. If you Google Antarctica, that is what you see, white, gray, blue pictures. When I, working down in Antarctica, bring up all these creatures from the seafloor, they are man-sized sponges, giant yellow sea stars, bright purple octopi. And when I see your photographs from Antarctica, they are stunning colors, all the colors of the rainbow. And so, yep, I used your 50 photographs that you took from under the sea surface and 50 photographs that I took above the sea surface, and simply made these color bars that really show off the juxtaposition of color in the Southern Ocean and really expose our preferences towards thinking about, the common media about Antarctica, rather than thinking about, wow, there's all this biodiversity down there. How can we look at that in a new way that focuses on color?
When telling a story, you have some options. Choose words and you get to lead people around by their imagination. Choose images and you get to lead them around by their eyes. But choose several images and the rules kind of change. And that's why I had to ask Jay how he goes about putting together his stories.
We're visual creatures. This is the amazing thing. We think in terms of still photographs. If I mention 9/11 or your first birthday, your first pet, the Iraq War, your first wedding, for some, your second wedding, whatever I mention, it's more likely than not a still image that comes to your mind. You did not call upon it. It came into your mind from having seen images, having experienced those things yourselves. But our mind thinks rapidly in bringing those still images up as a foundation for thought. I always tell people, try to run a video of your favorite movie for 2 minutes in your mind. It's impossible. Try a minute. Impossible. Try 10 seconds, 15 seconds of truly the continuity of the movie or film. You might be able to do that. But a still image, oh my gosh, it's instantaneous. And that's what the beauty of what I still love about this craft of photography is getting to sometimes make that image that is going to be the foundation of memory and of thought for a lot of people.
What was your first geographic story?
First geographic story was actually on a guy that walked across America it was published in 1979. I think that was before you were born, which is pretty amazing. But it was a fellow that walked across America. His name was Peter Jenkins. They did 2 parts of the story. Peter had walked into Geographic with the story idea of, hey, I'm going to walk across America. He had his dog Cooper with him, and editors of Geographic said, well, that's interesting. And they must have thought, well, if anything comes out of this, here's a camera and some film. Happened to be an Olympus camera too. But so he went and walked halfway across the United States to Dallas. They published that story, part one. It turned out to be one of the most popular stories they ever published. I met him in Dallas. I had to photograph him for the newspaper and got talking to him and became friends. And then my best friend from Texas, Skeeter Hagler, he and I combined to photograph Peter on the last section from Dallas to Florence, Oregon. They published that story. I really didn't feel like I was ready to shoot for a Geographic. That was rather intimidating at the time. And I continued working with newspapers, honing my craft or whatever you want to call it. It's a long, involved story, but essentially in 1988, I started working with Geographic. Shot the Yellowstone fires and went to Papua New Guinea for 3 months on a shoot. It's interesting. I was fortunate to have won the Pulitzer for my work in the war in El Salvador back in the early 80s. But I always tell people I wasn't a war photographer. I was a photographer covering a war. I'm not a wildlife photographer. I'm a photographer who covers wildlife. I'm a generalist. So I see what I do as kind of responding to whatever you're photographing. And I've always tried to apply that thinking that every one of those situations has its best moment. And I think if you do that in whatever type photography, whatever genre in which you're working, it forces you to really ramp it up. And I'm very objective about my own work. When it's not good, it's not good. But when you get that moment, when it comes together, you look at it, you know it when you press the shutter. You do know it. I mean, this is something I've been doing this for 46 years, and you know you've got it, or you know when it's building, you know when that moment's building, and when everything comes together, there's no other electricity on earth like that. And you press a shutter, and it's like, oh my God, that was it. And you have that luxury of the monitor on the back of the digital camera today to confirm it. In film days, you didn't have that, and you were just, hoping everything technically was there when you shot the thing. And that's what I loved about having shot film for years too, is that it taught me that methodical component. It enforced that of you'd put a new roll of film in the camera and you were shooting something that was building, El Salvador, whatever. Everything's hitting the fan. The moment's about to happen. You've been doing this count. It was 36 when you started. You're down to 10, 12, 9 frames. Do I change film now or do I wait? So film really forced me that idea of watching those situations.
Hi there, I'm Charlotte Fisher, and you're listening to Meet the Ocean Creature Feature. The venom of the banded sea crate, or the Laticata colubrina, is one of the most toxic poisons in the world. That means that the poison in these snakes is powerful enough to be lethal to several grown men with just a small dose, making them a bit scary to swim with. I've actually been lucky enough to snorkel with banded sea krates in the waters of Niue, an island in the South Pacific, home to quite a few of these sea snakes. As I said earlier, banded sea krates are incredibly poisonous. However, quite luckily, very non-aggressive towards humans, or at least the ones I met were. I'm not saying that you should necessarily get close to highly venomous sea snakes. I digress. Banded sea krates are pretty unique among sea snakes, not only in their beautiful black and white designs, but also with their ability to move easily between land and sea, getting their food from the ocean, where they spend most of their time, and courting and laying their eggs on dry ground. Fun fact, banded sea krates can actually climb trees. I wouldn't walk under any low-hanging branches during their breeding season. Banded sea krates have proportionally large lungs, which they use to dive for upwards of 30 to 40 minutes in order to hunt for prey. These sea snakes, that's a tongue twister, are also incredibly mesmerizing to watch swim. They have flat, paddle-like tails, which they use to move around in the water. Adult lady krates can reach upwards of approximately 50 inches, whereas their male counterparts are a bit smaller, growing up to 30 or so inches. Banded sea krates will primarily feed on eels and occasionally small fish that they manage to corner. Finally, remember, banded sea krates are very docile. If you encounter one, don't be scared. It probably won't bite you unless you act very aggressive or stick your finger directly into its mouth, which I highly, highly recommend you don't do. Thanks for listening.
Sea snakes swimming. So, having seen the diversity of your work, I have to ask about some of the rock and roll history. because you got this one photo of Mick Jagger and Keith Richards in the rain. I don't. Was it at Giant Stadium?
No, that was in Dallas. That's when I worked at the newspaper. Yeah, I used to photograph rock and roll, and I always tell people, if you ask me a question, I go, what? Yeah, it's because I used to photograph rock and roll, and it took out a considerable amount of my hearing. I remember Pete Townsend talking about that, from The Who, his hearing's in horrible shape, and I wasn't smart enough to protect my hearing at the time. But yeah, those were fun days, and I do love that photograph, actually. It's Jagger and Richards on stage in Dallas. It's in a torrential downpour, and the first thing, when you look at the image, you think, is Keith Richards plugged into his amp? Why isn't, Keith Richards looks like he's been fried by lightning many times, but why didn't he get it zapped completely? He had to be remote on that. But it's an ethereal picture, and I really like that. It's funny because all that old black and white, I photographed Hendrix and Led Zeppelin and on their first American tour, and The Who, back when they were the backup band to the Herman's Hermits and Blues Magoos. And
we're running the west coast of Greenland right now, but you and I did get to dive together.
Yes, we did.
And that was in a place that I don't know if I'll ever get something that good again. It was Millennium Atoll.
That was spectacular. I've been diving for a long time. I was actually working on a dive master certification back in the late 70s, early 80s. I never got to finish that, but I love diving. And then on that trip, you were gracious enough to help me out on that. And we dove Millennium, and we dove a few other places. And that was just spectacular. I forgot what it feels like. I'd forgotten what it felt like to float in the ether with all these colors and everything going on around you. There was, I had three favorite pictures from that. There was one in Niue of a banded sea crate going back under the water, and it was one of those things, again, I shot the thing, it's like, holy schmoly, did that really happen? And I looked at it right away, and it's like, oh my gosh, it's there.
Jay, it is always a pleasure to travel with you. I hope that we get to do it again next year.
Paul, I know we'll see each other again. I hope I'll have my mask with me so we can go back under there. Thanks a lot. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, maybe we'll get you in the water in Antarctica.
I would love that. Well, yep, I would do it.
Meet the Ocean would like to thank Jay Dickman, Charlotte Fisher, and Skye Moret for their contributions. You can view Jay's photography at jdickman.net and Skye's science and design work at skyemoret.com. This episode was produced by me, Eric Weremeister, editing and sound by Andrew Gettings, with original music by Vin Gast. Meet the Ocean is a listener-supported podcast, which recently became a 501c3 nonprofit organization. This means that all donations to help us educate the public about the salt waters are now tax-free. Find out more at meettheocean.org and follow us daily on Instagram at meettheocean. Thanks for listening.